Hey, Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec here. Wanted to chat a little bit about the Department of Homeland Security releasing a directive to all government agencies to secure their DNS control panels or DNS control in general for basically for their zone files with multi-factor authentication. This is actually a really interesting request. I shouldn't say request. Let's go with a very interesting directive because it tells us quite a bit about DHS priorities along these lines, as well as their response to industry events. So I want to back up a little bit first, chat about the fact that both Cisco's Talos Group as well as FireEye both have released independent research showing that attackers are indeed compromising control panels control panels for DNS to ultimately be able to issue certificates, right? Fraudulent certificates, as well as redirect traffic, web traffic, as well as any other traffic for that matter that relies on the domain name system. For those that don't know what DNS is, by the way, DNS is the service on the internet that maps basically a domain name to an IP address to facilitate communication. So to back up, kind of to get the overall lay of the land, typically when you register a domain, your registrar provides you access to a control panel, and that control panel itself then allows you to go in and set up DNS settings. Now, this is the most common way that most people in commercial space register and maintain a domain. Of course, you have another option, right? Another option that you have is, in this particular case, the registrar is actually hosting your DNS services for you. Now, this is independent of whether or not they actually host your website, right? Very frequently, you'll host your website on a server, but they will host your DNS, right? And this is the way that many, I would say the vast majority of small, medium businesses work, right, in the United States. Now, you have another option, of course, which is to repoint through your domain registrar. Say, look, we're not going to use your DNS services. We're going to use our own DNS services. Now, some people think this provides better security. I'm kind of up in the air on this particular one. We have seen a couple of cases of registrars where they had problems with their web portals, security problems with their web portals that allowed attackers to change DNS settings for the domain, basically the zone files for the domain without authentication, right? So in that particular case, it does actually give you a little bit better security to run your own and manage your own DNS server and services. But the question comes up, how when you make that DNS request initially, obviously it goes to your DNS server, and then something called recursion kicks in from there, right? So your DNS server then consequently says, okay, well, where do I go for this? Well, let's say it's renditioninfosec.com. You're going to go to .com, basically a .com root server that's going to then point you back down and say, okay, here's where the authoritative zone file for Rendition InfoSec can be found. Right, and that's going to point you to a DNS server. And of course, we have multiple layers of subdomains there. You're going to follow that process throughout those subdomains. So then the question comes out to, well, okay, what if I want to run my own DNS server? Right? How does it know where to look, or where do we know? How do we know the authoritative zone file there? Well, the answer is that the registrar, part of your registrar information, and even after GDPR, WHOIS still allows you to see, for obvious technical reasons, WHOIS still allows you to see who's running the authoritative DNS server for the domain. What IP address should you contact to get records about the domain? Okay, so we know that we could host it or the registrar could host it. In either case, if your account isn't protected with multi-factor authentication, that of course leaves that account open to password stuffing attacks. Password stuffing, for those that don't know, or credential stuffing attacks, basically are where attackers obtain credentials from some other dump, and then use those credentials to access an account. Right. So let's say that you have shared passwords, shared usernames and passwords across multiple different accounts on different domains and different types of services. Attackers might use the password and username from one to try to log in elsewhere. So as we take a look at the DNS side, what can an attacker do with this, right? Well, they can create brand new subdomains. They can reroute your subdomain to create man-in-the-middle attacks, right? Now, I hear a couple of you saying, no, HTTPS. Well, you have to know that one of the ways that you can get a certificate ultimately is to basically is to place place a file on your web server. That's one, right? That you can put it inside the web root. It'll have a specific name with a specific value, and that's one of the many tests that can be done. Of course, if you control DNS, you control where that file goes, and now you can get a legitimate certificate for that domain. Others are going to say, well, sometimes there can be an email verification for that. Well, I have bad news for you, my friends, because as it turns out, DNS controls how your email works too. There's something called an MX record, mail exchanger record, and then MX record or records, right? You may have multiple records there for load balancing or failover purposes. That ultimately DNS controls how your mail is delivered, your email is delivered as well. So an attacker with control of your DNS server can now receive legitimately issued certificates for your domain. And in fact, FireEye and Talos have both observed very large-scale attacks in the wild doing exactly this, right? Compromising control panels of registrars. Now, I'll tell you, we've worked multiple incident responses at Rendition InfoSec that have involved a component of this, although not on a wide scale, right? In a couple of cases, we've suspected an insider, had some disgruntled insider possibly play. There's been other cases where indeed credential stuffing attack was used to take over the domain, but never from in every case that we've worked. I should say in every case. In most cases that we've worked, actually, kind of thinking back, in most cases we've worked, this kind of stuff has been used ultimately to either as a phishing landing page or to deliver you name it, spam landing pages, deliver malware with an exploit kit in one case, but it's pretty rare that we see advanced attackers, and when I say advanced attackers, let me come back and say nation-state style attackers using this as a piece of basically as a piece of their intelligence collection infrastructure. But of course, it could be done, right? Now, the reason I bring that up is I want to circle back around to the government side, right? Because now we have DHS issuing this directive, and in fact, in their own directive, they mention the FireEye and the the Talos reports. So we know that this is at least partially prompted the directive. This actually brings up a couple of great questions, right? So the actual directive itself says that there's actually 2 dates in the directive. By Friday, they need a report. DHS wants a report from subordinate agencies, basically detailing whether or not they're done and what specifically, basically what they're doing to correct the action, what their domain, inventory kind of looks like, right? So there's a lot that plays in there. That's kind of step one, right? A week from Friday, then they are basically being told that they have to now have that multi-factor authentication in play. Okay, so let's think about this for a minute though, right? Because I'm wondering what .gov domains, right? DHS issues this initiative. That's great. What .gov domains? Is this really going to be a registrar problem? And the short answer is I don't know, but I don't think so, right? Now, the government themselves, right, within the .gov domain space, the U.S. government in the .gov domain space, this is going to be kind of interesting to see. Basically, again, is what kind of multi-factor do they have in place, right? If it's a matter of you need multi-factor authentication back to change a zone file on your DNS server. There are some government agencies still running legacy Active Directory domains, right? Which, again, maybe they're pushing that DNS from a Active Directory server. Again, there's a lot of unknowns here, and the directive itself is kind of interesting. I'd like to pitch kind of a theory here because I think it's actually really interesting that DHS pushes this directive down during the government shutdown. Right? Now, whether or not this is a political play or not, who knows? What we do know is it's day 33 of the government shutdown. There's not an immediate end in sight or predicted in sight, and definitely not before this Friday when there are updates due. Largely, systems administration personnel are not available at work, to perform these types of changes, right? Furthermore, from a security standpoint, I don't care whether the system admins are there or not. I guarantee you, most of the affected agencies, their change control boards are not there, right, and are not holding meetings, right? So this is a really interesting piece here because depending on what needs to change, right, and what types of accesses need to occur there, this is going to be a really interesting play, right? Because again, as we make these changes, these fundamental changes here, we've got some questions about for instance, if they do have a DNS control panel who can update the zone files, was it a shared login in the first place that they kind of had a checkbox for? And now, if they're having a new multi-factor and it's tied back to a mobile device or to an RSA key, RSA token, or to a whatever, right, for this multi-factor, now I've got to step back and ask, have we created a central point of failure? Central point of failure there, right? So again, now we're talking about the integrity versus the availability issue, right? The integrity of the zone files is what we're intending, DHS is intending to fix with this directive. But now we have a question of, could that negatively impact availability of the basically of the need, or sorry, of the access to the control panel to be able to do subsequent updates, right? So there's a lot at play here, right? I'll mention here that, again, kind of reiterate that without the change control boards in place in the middle of this government shutdown, this is going to be hard to do well, right? There's already some news reports that by and large people are going to have to be called in to make this happen, right? So basically called back or recalled. Of course, they'll be working without pay, right? So we know they're not going to get paid yet initially. I'm not sure that this is a smart move, right? Now, again, I don't mean in any way to talk bad about or infer that any government employees or federal employees who aren't being paid might, be insider threats. But look, there's just a reality to this, right? That there are only a fixed number of, or a pretty well-known number of reasons that people motivations that people have for doing generally malicious activity. And so as I kind of look at this, I think, well, I don't know that I want to bring somebody in the middle of a shutdown without anything else in sight, without an end in sight, without a paycheck in sight, basically to come in and make critical changes to my infrastructure. My friends, make no mistake about it, DNS is critical infrastructure, right? So we're talking about now making critical changes to critical infrastructure that could easily impact the availability, right? We talk a lot about bug doors when we discuss cybersecurity, and definitely from a code auditing standpoint. There's the idea of a backdoor, which I think is fairly common to most people, or fairly familiar to most people. We also have the concept of bug door, right? And very frequently when we're doing code auditing at Rendition, we find backdoors that are so either obfuscated or don't match a code pattern, and I say a backdoor, let me back up and say a bug that would allow remote access that doesn't, or privilege escalation, or whatever the particular thing is, where you look and you're like, could that have been done on purpose, right? Look, likewise here, right? Could an admin who's now being recalled in, could they actually stage an outage, right? And then plausibly, very plausibly, by the way, blame it on the fact that there wasn't a lot of change control and a lot of planning that went into this. This is a fairly large, has the potential to be a fairly large lift and shift. Now, again, if it's just that they're using a third-party registrar, all they have to do is press the button and say enable two-factor authentication. Great. The follow-up, of course, becomes, does that create a single point of failure? Is it tied to a single handset? What's the recovery look like? There's a lot that we consult, or a lot that we discuss with our consulting clients at Rendition before they adopt multi-factor authentication. Now, I have to tell you that I'm not knocking MFA here in any way, shape, or form. As some of you probably know, Rendition's a Duo partner, and we absolutely believe in Duo. As a multi-factor authentication solution, I believe in multi-factor overall. But that doesn't mean it's a panacea, and it doesn't mean that it comes without its issues, right? So again, one of the things that I'd want to know, I'd want to study up front is, again, if that handset gets lost, what's our recovery look like for being able to get back into this critical infrastructure to go update something for these domain names. Now, look, the second part of the guidance that DHS has is not only now let's go check, let's go make sure that we have multi-factor authentication, but the follow-up is, do we have any of our existing domains, were there unauthorized changes, one, and second, did we issue any certs, were any certificates issued for this, right? This is going to come largely from certificate transparency logs. Now, I think, again, with the government, this is probably less of a problem, right, than it is with most commercial clients, but still probably something that we want to look at, right? Were any malicious certificates, were any certificates fraudulently issued without the knowledge of the systems administration personnel? Okay, so wrapping all this up here in the middle of a government shutdown, it's a big lift and shift without all the right people in place. So now I have to ask, what's the motivation? Is it really to get the government? Because again, I'm not positive that many government agencies are using third-party registrars. Again, I don't know. We don't do a lot of work with the federal government for a lot of reasons. I'm gonna leave that alone. But look, I will mention this though. I think part of the motivation here is that by DHS making a directive for all federal agencies to perform these changes, right, within the next 2 weeks, I think what they've done is they've taken some reporting from Talos and FireEye that admittedly made some waves inside the security community, not as big as I really thought they would, but still a couple of waves here. And what they've done, I think, is they've created a giant ripple effect, right? Because we now have clients that are calling and talking to us about and saying, hey, what do we need to do? Right? If the government is directing this for all federal agencies, right, that this has to be done, not only has to be done, but it has to be done quickly in the middle of this, in the middle of the shutdown event, right? Now, again, I think DHS would have issued the guidance, shutdown or no shutdown, right? But particularly in the middle of the shutdown, I feel like it's screaming a little bit higher urgency than it might have had otherwise. So, what do you need to do? Right? First off, enable multi-factor on your registrar. Registrar control panels. This is true whether you use the registrar's DNS servers or your own DNS servers, because remember, an attacker who has access to your control panel can repoint your DNS server for the authoritative server for the zone. Right? They then can become the authoritative server for the zone. That's not something you want, right? Okay, so they can do that. What's next? All right, we want to go back. We want to review our certificate transparency logs. Cert.sh, right, is a great place to go there. Census.io would be another way to go take a look at some of those certificate transparency logs. Go back and look for your domain name and see if any new certificates have been issued that you didn't request. If that's the case, that they have been, you know you have some work to do. What do you do in those particular cases, right? Well, look at who the certificate issuer was. Go ahead and notify the certificate issuer. Now, this is a spot where this is probably going to come in a little bit and sound, sound like, well, maybe I can just sweep that under the rug because it probably won't matter. But look, the reality is anybody with that certificate can man in the middle of your traffic without your web traffic, without your users knowing. That's not ideal, right? So we want to make sure, of course, that we notify the certificate provider, who's ultimately then going to put it on basically their certificate revocation list, right? Their CRL. Once they put it on their CRL, your browser then is going to check that certificate revocation list, and within about 24 hours, because again, different browsers and different update frequencies and whatnot, within about 24 hours, that certificate will now not be trusted. Now, a lot of times we get the question, will your legitimate certificate for the same domain continue to be trusted? The answer there is yes, absolutely. They're not pulling it by the domain name, they're pulling it by the certificate fingerprint, pulling, revoking, what have you, right? And when we say revoking trust, right, they can't actually take the certificate back, right? So what's happening here is they're going to take that certificate fingerprint, they're going to put that in the certificate revocation list, and then as your browser goes and tries to negotiate a TLS session, I hope it's a TLS session, with that remote server, it's going to receive the fingerprint, basically the public key, as it were, or public key fingerprint of that certificate. Your browser then is going to check its certificate revocation list and see, is that fingerprint in the certificate revocation list? If so, don't trust the certificate, right? So it's not going to impact your operations today. But on that note, I have to tell you that just because, let's say you've got one certificate for www.renditioninfosec.com, and then an attacker who compromises our DNS control panel is able then to also issue a certificate for www.renditioninfosec.com. My legitimate certificate is going to continue to work just fine. It's not going to revoke the original certificate. Mine will continue to work just fine. Theirs, on the other hand, will continue to work just fine. It's just a matter of where that traffic goes. So with that, somebody could indeed man in the middle of the traffic. So I'm going to be reviewing, of course, and we do as a matter of basically as a matter of security, continuously monitor our certificate revocation, or sorry, excuse me, certificate transparency logs, looking for certificates for the multitude of domains that we own, and certainly are looking to see if anything has been updated or changed there that we should know about. Now, again, if this is not something you're doing on a regular basis, I highly recommend that you begin. And at a minimum, this would be a great time to go ahead and do that. Now, look, I'm going to go ahead and and close it off here. There's a lot to unpack in this, but I'll mention here that, of course, if you need any help with, basically with this, or in the worst possible case, right, you find out that indeed somebody has issued fraudulently issued certificates for one of your domains, feel free, of course, to contact us, and we can walk you through that incident response process and assist where needed. So with that, I'm going to go and close it out here. Appreciate your time. Jake Williams from Edition InfoSec, signing off.